Thank you for turning into our podcast. I am Mary Bowen, and this is my sister, Faustina Bowen. We are the hosts for this episode, and we are speaking to Anthony D'Ambrosio. How are you doing, Anthony?
Doing really well. How are you guys?
We're good, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
And
Yeah.
D'Ambrosio is releasing a film that we are looking forward to, along with many of other Catholic film enthusiasts. I've heard that the film is being shown already on a few screenings, but Anthony, can you tell us a little bit about The Triumph of the Heart, as well as where and when we can expect to go see this film?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So this is a movie about St. Maximilian Kolbe's passion. You can imagine it something like a combination of the Passion of the Christ and 12 Angry Men. So it's set in Auschwitz and follows the relationships that he has with the other men in the cell through their final days as he fights to forge a brotherhood of hope with them in the darkest place on earth. And we shot it in Poland and are releasing it in September of this year. And it will be in theaters. We will probably be we'll be in every like major city and then in some of the smaller ones. So it depends on where you live, whether or not you'll be able to see it that way, or if you will want to catch it with streaming. But after that, we'll be going to streaming on all the platforms where you can watch films these days.
I do want to talk a little more about the project, but Anthony, I'm under the impression that you work with your brother on the project as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. My brother is my twin, identical twin, and partner, and also body double. So yeah, he's one of my. So he and I have been. We were also homeschooled, so we have that in common. We grew up, with a very imaginative childhood, as most homeschoolers do, just sort of addicted to books and to reading, and because we're protected, I think, from a lot of the like outside influences of pop culture and kind of technology and the evil public school system, we just had a lot more creativity and I think more connection with like the old stories. And that really was what kind of led us to wanting to start Sherwood Fellows, which is an agency that we've been working on for over a decade now to help organizations to communicate their mission through beauty in a way that helps them to produce revenue and growth and to bring forward their mission more excellently. So I got my start really directing by doing commercials and like branded content when I was working on the agency.
Yeah, we do have a lot in common.
Yes, I
That's
know.
amazing. Um,
Mhm.
what about St. Maximilian's story really jumped out to you as the next story that you wanted to tell and made you feel like compelled to make it into a film?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was actually very uninterested in Maximilian Kolbe during my kind of growth as a young man and a Christian. I was, he gives the impression just through the photography and also some of his writings that he's just sort of this like very militant kind of cold personality, and that was like a little bit. Just wasn't my vibe of Catholicism. I'm Italian, so think Saint Francis and all the animals and um, Saint Boniface and just like all these sort of Franciscan thinkers and mystics. And so I think what brought me to him was that I went through a season of like really great suffering during which I lost my faith and really lost a lot of hope in life in general. And his story, I think that I've been trying to figure out exactly how it got onto my radar because it wasn't like I was looking for stories of saints at the time. But I think that there was a time when I was doing web copy for some sort of Catholic publication, and I had to write something about Colby and was doing some research. And I realized that he was executed with three other men, that out of the 10 men who were put in the cell, he wasn't the only one that survived all of those 14 days. And at the time, I was really looking for a reason to live and a reason to believe in life and in hope, even when suffering was kind of the main experience of my life. And I saw that he obviously had not only gone through that journey himself, but had brought others along with him. And I just felt this kind of incredible compassion from him, and saw the story not from the perspective of the man whose life that he saved, but from the men whose souls he saved. I mean, from the men uh, who were going into the most terrifying death that one could possibly imagine, and um, who were going to have to go through that slowly, like excruciatingly slowly. And he stepped into that, volunteered to join them in their suffering, and then ministered to them while they were there. And in some ways, it just felt like he began to do that for me.
This is actually a really good lead into my next question. I saw a post that you did about Gaudete Sunday and how there's a lot of people that talk about happiness and how you pretty much have to be perfectly comfortable to be happy, and that that's actually very different than what we as Catholics and Christians describe as being real joy. How do you feel that the triumph of the heart reflects joy, despite it actually, if you're looking at it from a worldly perspective, this is a really sad story. How do you feel
Mhm.
like it's bringing the joy out?
Man, it's really hard to answer that without giving like the ending away. But I think that when I was doing research on Colby, I learned that he had a dream, a vision of heaven when he was in Japan when he was sick. He was very sick, and something that I've always struggled with is chronic illness. So he was somebody that also struggled with that. And despite his like huge mission, he was often bedridden. And during one of these times in bed, he had a vision of heaven that he never told anyone about, but that really drove him for the rest of his life. And I think my depiction of Colby in this film is like a man who's driven by that vision. And so his he has a great amount of grief as he's building these deep relationships of love with like his fellow countrymen, and as he's watching them die. But he has this expectation and sense of where where they are all going that brings levity into the cell. And um, I think one of the other things that is um, an important part of like my meditation on this whole, I guess, time is that if you're going to get men to face suffering together and to stay alive for that long, what likely is going to be a big part of that is going to be humor. Like if you've ever found a group of men suffering together, what you will also find is a group of men who are like making the most inappropriate jokes in the world, and are in some way like finding this dark, ironic humor in the midst of their suffering. And so I brought that kind of, I guess, that experience of masculine, facing suffering together into the film. And so there's lots of moments where you would not expect, but that end up being like really funny. As we've watched it with audiences, there's like so many of them just like laugh out loud at certain moments that they just were not expecting to laugh.
I'm sure it's something that you ran across when you were working on the script for the story and even filming the story. And we've run across it ourselves working on our own project.
Mhm.
And it's turning saints, taking the stories of saints and putting it into film, and how sometimes it's been badly done, where you were recently talking about this as well. It comes across as a boring story. And so I'm sure that some effort went into making St. Maximilian Kolbe more relatable, more like someone we would know in our everyday lives. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think most of the time the reason why stories are boring is because um, they just, as we're writing about the saint, we make them a saint from like their earliest birth, and just sort of like make them a static character that doesn't change. And that's just not how humanity is. So we're not attracted to stories like that. For me, one of the biggest things that I was having to do to make the story interesting was to dig into who Colby was and to actually meet him as a human. And to do that, it's actually very difficult because most of the things that we read about saints are things that were documented and kind of come out during their canonization process.
Mhm.
And all of those people are basically trying to prove that, the person that their hometown hero is a saint, right? So like they're not putting in like, oh, and he also struggled super intensely with perfectionism and like they're not installing the dark side of the person that they had to overcome in any of the things that they're submitting. So that was part of the difficulty for me was that as I was reading all these biographies, it's like, oh yeah, he was like this perfect child, and then he was this perfect adolescent, and then he was this perfect person in Auschwitz, and you're like, I don't think that anyone could possibly relate to this. But as I went to Poland and actually got out there and started to really um, converse with those who were in his in his community. These are monks who were there, or friars who were just one generation removed from him. They actually have the historical kind of person of Colby much more close at hand than the biographers do. And as any family does, they don't talk about them like they're not human, like they were perfect. They're like talking about somebody they're very fond of, and who also had some really frustrating and annoying flaws that made it very hard to be in communion with them. And that was where I kind of got the kernel of like of what Colby had to journey through to become the person that we know him as now. And I dramatized that journey, and I think that's part of what makes the story interesting. I think the other part of it is just that like anytime you write a story about or like a script, we're talking I guess now in movie format, but if you're making a film, you have a very compressed amount of time, and most of the time people make biographical films, and it's really hard to do that because you're stretching like years and years and years all into this like compressed thing, and it's very hard to tell like a story that has stakes where there's like winners and losers and like dark nights of the soul and all that. It's like if you're just going to put 50 years of a person's life into a movie, you basically just have some plot points that are all strung together, but you don't really have a story. And so part of it is just that like kind of misunderstanding of what film is and what the medium is capable of doing. And as filmmakers like us get more and more, I think, resources, like we can extend out into doing video series and shows, and those are more biographical. They're more like books. You have more space to tell a story, so you can kind of tell more time. But with a feature film, it's actually surprising how little you can fit into that, and um, yeah, make it interesting. So those are some of the problems that I see.
Part of the whole many movies being birthed to death for Saints, it kind of has hurt the market for Saint movies because people are expecting them to all, same old, same old. So I'm sure that you knew that before you started this film. So what were some of the doubt demons that you had in feeling like this was even doable? And how did you
Mm.
overcome the temptation, feeling like no one's gonna be interested, everyone's gonna feel like it's gonna be a boring movie?
Yeah, I never thought that people would think it was boring because I knew that the way that we were approaching it was like um, there's real stakes. Like it's a life or death type situation, and there's a lot of suspense because the men don't necessarily know that they're going to die from the beginning. There's reason to believe that maybe the Nazis will find the missing prisoner and they might be let out if they last long enough. So things like that create these beats in the story that you can just like um, that will be entertaining and create suspense. I think the doubt demons for me were like, who am I to venture out and do this? Like, this is one of the greatest saints of our era. He's Polish. I'm not Polish. Like, he's not my culture. Who am I to go to Poland and be and raise my hand and say, I'm going to be the one to tell your story. I think that was a huge one. Believing that as a first-time filmmaker, that people in the Catholic space would come behind me and trust me and give me money. It's like, hey, buy me a house, right? Like we're talking about $500,000 that somebody is trusting me to tell this story, is entrusting in me to tell this story, and um, I I think that that amount of money was like mind-boggling to me when I was getting started, and just totally out of like the question for what I could possibly raise. Um, and yeah, each step of the way, it's like a lot of imposter syndrome because I haven't done this before. Who am I to coach these like movie stars in Poland who have tons of experience with other directors, or we had a the hair and makeup person had just come off the set of the last Hunger Games movie, and I'm giving her these like crazy demands that she is just very much not used to, and I have to put my foot down and just like commit to what I think needs to happen. And all of that stuff is like these sorts of moments of having to be incredibly assertive about the mission that God has called me to, that where I just have to only rely on the credibility of the gospel in me, like Saint Paul, relying on the credibility of his vision of Christ. There's nothing else that he has as a calling card to say that he should be an apostle, but um, that's what God kind of wills, and what turns out to be the case has been that God has continued to bless the project as we've stepped forward, and as I've like had that faith in him, and in myself. So yeah, he God definitely equips the called, that's for sure.
And were there any particular devotions that you felt like strengthened you in your resolve to do the story anyway?
I'm not a really big devotions guy. Like my faith has always been a little bit more unstructured with
Mm.
like meditation, and when I was in seminary, we learned like the Ignatian kind of approach of Lectio Divina and imaginative prayer. And as an artist, that's always been very that has been the way that I've kind of connected with the Lord the most. Um, and for me, the actual process of making the film was very much a an an act of Lectio Divina. If I'm seeing this story and Colby as like this icon of Christ, my ability to sort of put myself into the cell and to write the script is very much like process of meditation on Christ and his power. So it was really amazing because, I mean, maybe you guys have experienced this kind of thing too, but when you bring together like a whole community of people who are all meditating on a holy story, it really does almost become like a little religious community, with a charism that unites them. And there's almost like this conduit of the Holy Spirit because of that closeness, where it just sort of like saturates the room, saturates the community, and each vision and each sort of mystical kind of experience or devotion that a person is bringing to the table gets amplified by the rest who are beside them in that shoulder and shoulder. And that was very much how it felt going to Poland, being poor, very similar to like meditating on Colby's like move to Japan. Like there's no ability for a Polish person to understand or discern the street signs in Japan. Like to go out there and just to make a newspaper that he literally, it was under a year. I think it was actually a very similar amount of time from when we got funding to when we made the movie, to how he like got funding and went to Japan and got his newspaper off the ground. But like I every single moment of being in poverty, not knowing where we were going to stay that night, not having any money to be able to do the thing that we had to do and hire the people we had to hire, and just like begging all the time, people getting sick, and just all of it felt very much like this moving meditation on Colby's life, that allowed us all to sort of enter into Christ and his story through the story of Colby.
So I guess my next question would be that you recently were talking about how in our culture we're experiencing a decline in morality and in faith, and how there might be a connection between that decline and the incline of bad entertainment. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, just serve me a softball and put me on a soapbox there, like this is definitely a crusade. I got to do youth ministry for about 6 years um after being in seminary. And what I realized as I was doing that was just that these kids are all plugged into pop culture and they're all watching shows, TV shows, movies, and it's hours and hours a day of media that they're consuming. And almost all of that media is supporting a particular worldview that is like that rabidly anti-Christian. At least now, like I think perhaps back in the heyday of Disney, there was something probably a lot more of Christianity installed in the virtues of Hollywood and what they were producing. But now, what is being made and being digested by our young people is something that is in direct conflict with whatever we're trying to teach them. And no matter how much a parent is talking to a child about the faith, um, or how many times they're going to church, it's if you add up the amount of time that the kids are spending with media and add up the amount of times meaningful conversations that a parent's having with their child or like exposure to the church, the media is going to win out every time. That's just how our culture works right now, unless you are like, our families where you've sort of made this very intense decision to kind of not participate in culture. But I don't think that that is a winning strategy for evangelization. Like what our goal should be is to protect our culture, protect our children enough to build a new culture that we can then evangelize other people into. And so if we want to do that, and to be making an impact in culture, and we don't want all of our kids to sort of be swept up by the slipstream of um, yeah, anti-Christian nihilistic media, then we are going to have to tell stories that are as entertaining, as interesting, that can bypass sort of the mental, like, I don't know, the prefrontal cortex and just install values directly into the subconscious, the same way that media is doing right now in with anti-Catholic messages. So that's the soapbox.
I really feel like I hear this over and over again. There's so many things that are going on in the world right now. Why are you focused on film? Like that's just to entertain
Mhm.
us. I personally feel like it's really important to be showing stories that are going to shape our future culture, like you were saying, by instilling those values in our children is really important battle that needs to be fought now alongside all of the other battles. But could you share a little bit about how powerful you feel like a story is in shaping a person's character and why
Yeah,
that's
the best example that I can give of that is every single moment where the church has exploded in new converts. It's been after the story of a saint or the story of a martyr was disseminated. And you can see this with the early church. Like it was the story of Christ and his relationship with the disciples, his crucifixion, resurrection that became the groundswell that converted Rome. It took 300 years for that story to sort of worm its way into the ears of the emperor and become like the core baseline operating system of the empire that killed Christ. And I think that what we often miss as Catholics, because we're very concrete and we love St. Thomas Aquinas, we love structure, we love um, like very tangible things that we can say that was how all of these people were fed, or that was a home that was built, or this is a college, education system that was created. We love to have those sorts of tangible results. And stories don't have that, right? Like it's very hard to say and track in some concrete way all of the people whose lives were altered. But if you just look at how human beings learn from the beginning of time until now, it's been around the campfire through whatever medium of storytelling and story digesting is most available at the time. Like there's a shaman who's telling the myths of the culture, and all the values of the culture are installed in those myths, and the people who are learning the stories are learning the values. It's one and the same. And since the Enlightenment, we've started playing the game of the culture, right? Like the Enlightenment is a very atheistic movement. It exalts reason above everything. And so it sort of removes all of the sacramental ritual and magic out of life. And it helps, I would say that it's a very post-Enlightenment instinct to call storytelling entertainment. Previously, that was a religious and meaningful mode that you're going into sort of the depths of history and identity to to receive a story. And the people who are the wisest are the people who are given the role of storytellers. In our culture right now, we see that as frivolous, and we're doing so to our own detriment and honestly to the loss of the minds of our youth.
Anthony, we only have a few minutes left. I was wondering if you would take the last few minutes to talk to us about what your desire of the film would be and what you would wish that its lasting legacy would be. And then just wrap up one more time by telling us when the film's coming out and then when we'll be able to see it and where possibly in what theaters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lasting legacy of this film is, I see it as so connected with the legacy of Saint Maximilian Kolbe, and there's so many ways that it's just so beautiful that Kolbe himself wanted to see an advent of Catholic film in order to combat fascism and communism and Freemasonry and all the sort of atheistic movements that were alive and well during his time. And he ultimately never got to see that vision become a reality, even though he, started the biggest publication in Poland at the time. But it was his life that ultimately became the story by which many were converted and had their faiths deepened. And the story of his death has becoming a movie that sparks a new renaissance in Catholic film and art. I think would be something that would so warm his heart. I think what we're doing is showing that it can be done by little people like ourselves who are not inside of the system, and that not only can it be done, but it can be done so well that it can reach out beyond the Catholic sort of ecosystem into culture and make an impact there as well. We just had a article by the Federalist, which is not a Catholic publication, reviewing the movie. And so it's just a good example of how a really good story about something heroic is interesting in general. And if it's brought forward into our culture, people will take note. So yeah, I would say that the legacy that I'm hoping for is a legacy of faith, is a legacy of creatives who are seeing what we did and saying, I could do that and I could do it better. And I hope they do. I hope you guys are inspired by it, and that it provides like a template for you for some of the next things that you're thinking about doing. And then in terms of where people can find it, if you want to follow along with our journey, you can find us at triumphoftheheart.com, or follow us at Triumph of the Heart on Instagram, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Anthony D'Ambrosio. Those are all great ways of getting connected. And we are hiring right now. We're looking for apprentices. We are looking for somebody that can be a design apprentice that really has talent for design, and also for somebody who's a logistics aficionado who knows how to make events happen and lead and coordinate volunteers. And those two people will be mentored by myself and our producer as we go through the process of releasing the film. So anybody listening to this that's interested in that, they should just go to our website and find the work with us in the footer and look at those positions.
All right. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for listening.